Greetings and salutations, dear viewer, and welcome to the third episode of the Indiscretions podcast. Please bear with me a little bit today because this sudden resurgence of wintry weather that we're having here in southeastern Pennsylvania is causing me to lose my voice a little bit, so if I sound a little hoarse, that's why. There's nothing particularly pressing on my mind today, so I think we're just going to talk a little bit about individualism and individualist philosophy, since this is really at the core of our website. It's really at the core of what I like to think about and talk about, and I don't think it gets enough attention in society. In fact, I think it's often sort of discarded as arcane or romantic and not that practical. And one of the places we've most recently seen this is in the President's State of the Union address, which reflected a nationalistic tone that's seeped into political discourse recently. And I don't mean in any ways to suggest that Donald Trump is solely the owner of this particular brand of thinking. It exists in different rhetorical and ideological positions. Populism, which is traditionally a view of the left wing in American politics, very much pushes nationalism. And the idea that um, individualism, and I think populism and nationalism in Trumpian form and in populist form, and people say Trump's a populist, I tend to disagree simply because populism tends to be more agrarian and Donald Trump is obviously not that. But that's a whole nother political quagmire we're not going to get into right now. But these two strains of thinking share a rhetorical root, and that is the idea of individual worth, but through the collective. If you go back and look at the populism of the late 1800s, there's an idea that um, normal people are under threat from this external force, and that in order to preserve the standard of living and the values to which individuals have become accustomed, they need the protection of the federal government, because this has the supreme governing authority and it can use that power to protect people. So there's this sort of outsourcing of individual agency to a body which is above the self in order to protect the self and promote the self, which seems like a strange way to promote individual autonomy to me. And I think that the nationalism of Trump and the modern Republican Party, and even the Democrats to some degree, comes through this, is this idea that individuals are strengthened through the collective, whether this be in the form of identity groups or whether this be in the form of nationalism. And during the State of the Union address, Trump appealed to this directly with the idea that Congress is a national monument, the idea that that people look to government to protect them, to improve their lives, right? So there's this fundamental ideal that individual worth comes from things outside of the self's capacity for achievement, and comes through endeavors not undertaken by the self, but undertaken by some external body on behalf of the self. And to define this as individualism is, I think, not only just wrong, but deeply problematic, because it really makes impossible the idea for true individualism. If individual worth is tied up in accomplishments that other people undertake on your behalf, then what is actual individual accomplishment when it's done from start to finish by the individual on the individual's merits alone? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is it gets turned into a sort of alienation, a sort of idea that people who are like that don't fit into society. They don't want to fit into society. There's something wrong with them because they don't want to participate and join this great community and this collective. And while I'm sympathetic to the view that diversity comes through strength, I don't think that this argument should be made primarily in the form of collectives, but rather in the form of individuals. This is another huge pet peeve of mine, is modern politics rips divisiveness, and it blames all political ills on divisiveness, normally in the form of partisanship. Yet, life is individual, right? Myself and you, my wonderful viewers, are not the same person. We think differently, we feel differently, we probably like different things. I would bet that my choice of music is different than your choice of music, or my favorite foods are different than your favorite foods. And this is true when it comes to trivialities such as what you eat for dinner, but it's also true of more substantive things like personal ideology. Ideology, in this case, being defined as a coherent set of beliefs, hopefully one that animates your life and creates a very consistent set of values, which promotes a sense of self and allows you to achieve more in life, because that, to us on politics of discretion, is what life should be based on. That is our view of individualism. And this divisiveness, which in this case we're not using as a pejorative, this idea that individuals as separate autonomous beings are fundamentally different from even the people they're closest to, is not a problem. If differences between people are real and substantive, then this is a good thing. It can help to build society up. For interest, I'm more of a creative person. When it comes to even simple tasks around my house with, like electrical work or putting up bookshelves, I'm awful at them. And left to my own devices, I would probably have a fairly basic subsistence. It would be a philosophically rich subsistence because I enjoy sitting around and thinking about things, but that's all abstract, and that doesn't contribute to my quality of life in the here and now in the corporeal world. So we need people who are good at both, who are both technically gifted and who are both artistically gifted, if we're to have a well-balanced life that is satisfactory and gratifying on a number of levels. But this is a division, right? The classic engineer versus artist divide. This is a division, but it's a division that is ultimately to the benefit of society. So long as we understand that that division helps to diversify the things that are available in life and ultimately enriches us. And this ought to be true in politics as well, particularly where ideology is concerned. Because ideology, as I've said, we define here as a consistent set of values applied across many aspects of life. Consistency is one of my primary values. It's one of the primary values of the discretionist philosophy. And this is obviously going to lead to different priorities in life. And when we come into conflict in politics with ideological differences and the prioritization of different goals, this ought to be a positive, because what that ought to do is spark consideration of, well, now here's my hierarchy of values, and here's person X's hierarchy of values. Now, is there any merit in mine that's not in theirs, or vice versa? So it should spark that kind of thought, which ultimately leads to improvement of not only the self, but to policy that ultimately should be grounded in that sort of rational discourse and is held up to objective philosophical standards. And hopefully the end result is something that reflects that very strict scrutiny. But that is often not what divisiveness is portrayed as. And yes, there is divisiveness that is bad, and this is what is often referred to as tribalism, and the idea that, Democrats don't like Republicans simply because they're Republicans, and Republicans don't like Democrats simply because they're Democrats, and nobody likes the libertarians because they're libertarians, right? This idea that some surface label that's ultimately meaningless is disqualifying. And it is not just disqualifying of, a person's judgment on a particular issue, but is existentially disqualifying. And this is ultimately collectivistic. We take a label and assign or impute values to an entire group based on stereotypes or perceptions of that label without actually examining that person or the group in whole to see if there's any difference, to see whether or not the values that have been imputed are actually true. So automatically we've shut down philosophical examination and made it impossible to have that rich, enriching definition of divisiveness that I just talked of. And this is also doesn't do any favors to individualism properly defined, because it emphasizes emphasizes individuals as part of a group and identifies them based on group and perceptions of group characteristics. So even though we recognize, person X is defined not by anything that is actually reflective of what they are fundamentally and at their core, but rather as, person X is a Democrat, or person X, likes this sort of music, and that says something about them based on all of these collectivistic social perceptions. And again, it makes it very hard to achieve anything as a truly individual, as a truly atomized, is a term you may have heard in reference to individualist philosophy, normally in a negative, but the atomized self, the self taken just as this one sovereign unit, is really impossible for them to achieve anything or even to determine who they are when you have a society that looks at things through this collectivist lens and identifies individualism through different collectivist lens. What is your political belief? What is your religious belief? And not to say that there's anything wrong with finding personal meaning in one's adherence to different groups, what's my ethnicity, what's my religion. But that alone doesn't say that much about individual. Taken in toto, all of those different labels, I'm a Christian, I am of Irish descent, I'm libertarian, I like this kind of art, I, am an engineer by trade, all of those labels taken in toto, and those are just examples, are what makes the individual. By themselves, they're a picture of the person, but not the complete person. The individual is only found through that completion. And ideally, what, at least from our philosophic perspective here at the Politics of Discretion, is that all of those different identity groups ought to be underlain by the same set of values. That those, whether one finds meaning in religion, whether one finds meaning in political philosophy, whether one finds meaning in one's job or in any number of those things, that what a person is driven to pursue those particular ends is a common set of values applied consistently across all of their endeavors. That's a mouthful, is probably a simpler way to say that. And by doing so, regardless of how one runs into an individual in society, whether one runs into them on a work function or socially or at a charitable event or religious service, one is meeting the same person, because that core set of values, which forms the nucleus of individual identity and is then applied to all areas of life, is present in everything that person does, which creates a consistent sense of self. And this at least to my way of thinking, makes individual achievement much more possible, because that same set of identity, or excuse me, that same set of values which underlies identity is then at the fundamental being of what one does. It's instinctual to pursue them. And this is where we get into absolutism. This is where I talk about substantive idealism, right? Because to my way of thinking, idealism is something that is actually physically attainable. Not in society at large, not in the sense of utopianism and, sweeping societal bodies that, everyone lives in perfect harmony and there's no crime and no one's ever offended, that sort of thing. But in that, if the individual has that sense of self, which is grounded in value and is persistently sought in all that they do, that makes whatever value it is they uphold, and it is that value that's driving them, they're embodying that value. What essentially they're doing is, if you have the value and then you have the self below it, by identifying with that value, pursuing it in all that they do, and making it the basis of all their actions, making attainment of it the basis of all their actions, what they're doing is taking that sense of self and lifting it up, and really enriching their life. And in doing that, that makes that value, that ideal, actually into a physical entity, because it is built into everything that they do, whether or not it's in the basis of the friendships that they pursue, whether it's reflected in their own personal set of religious or philosophical beliefs, or whether or not it's in the work that they do. And in that vein, I want to turn to the more creative side of the website, which we've been pursuing, because this is ultimately my personal embodiment of the values that I just talked about. So if you go to the website and you click on the Edification tab, and yes, I know that that is a terrible pun, but that's besides the point, you will see the page, and under the header is a quote from Ayn Rand, which is one of my favorites, and it is, art is the indispensable medium in the pursuit, art is the indispensable medium in the communication of a moral ideal. And this is this idea that whatever your hierarchy of values happens to be, whatever you put a primacy on, that ultimately grounds your creative pursuits or your work ethic. And so what Edifictions is a set of more artistic pieces, right, versus some of the more rank punditry that we put out there. We'll still be doing that, but we're going to move a little bit away from that and focus more on the artistic side, because and all of these pieces share something in common. They are grounded in some value. They attempt to communicate some sort of philosophical statement about ideals that we believe in. And they fall under two categories. So we have the more visual art, which at the moment, all of that are things that I've drawn. And we're also going to do some more prose pieces. And at the moment, we just have one of those, which I'm very happy to be able to bring one of my very best friends along. Brett Salter has written a short story. It's sort of a weird fiction piece. I highly recommend it. But so the idea is that these are creative pieces, so they're meant to entertain, but they're also think pieces. So they're supposed to spark consideration of some value or some idea. And the thinking behind this is my own personal belief, because I have a background in the arts, and I also have a background in journalism and political science and more formal writing, which tends to be, a little more cut and dry, straightforward, very serious. And I think to hold arts and more serious um, endeavors at odds is probably not the best way to do things. A lot of particularly journalistic writing takes itself very seriously, and it's actually very formulaic. You make your point, you have supporting evidence A, supporting evidence B, and you move on. And I think that the more rhetorical side of writing, rhetoric in this case, not in the way that it's commonly used, but in the actual sense of the word, in different strategies for communicating a viewpoint or an argument, which tends to breathe a little bit more life, a little bit more personality into a piece. And this to me is highly important, particularly in politics, because politics is often, as I've said, divisive, is often something that people are turned off on because they see it in these black and white partisan terms. It's full of arguments, it's full of anger, and people just shut themselves off to it. And that just perpetuates the problems with the political cycle. And we're not even getting to the philosophy which should ground political discourse. So, how do you force people, or not force people, but how do you encourage them to look at these issues in a deep and substantive way? Well, to me, the answer to that seems to be more artistic forms of communication, more enjoyable forms of communication. Examples of people who have done this well, Ayn Rand, although Ayn Rand's highly divisive, but if you can get past that, her work I think is genius. George Orwell, Rod Serling is a tremendous example of sort of creative think pieces. And so this is what we're aiming to do with Edifiction, is to entertain and at the same time to edify. And I haven't decided yet whether or not, particularly with some of the more visual work, whether we'll be explaining what's at the heart of them, or we'll just allow people to speculate and ruminate and try to spark creative thought that way. But that is one direction that we're going to take the website in, and in doing more of that, because that's really getting back to my roots and what I love to do. I started out as more of a creative writer before I ended up in politics. A weird, strange trip. But so that is hopefully the direction that the website will be going in. That kind of creative work takes a lot more time and effort, so it might be a little slower. And as always, feedback is always appreciated. We would love to hear from you with ideas, with thoughts. I'm trying to figure out a way to create a more interactive element to the website, whether or not it's in a chat room that's hosted on the website somewhere. But contributions of that sort, if you have thoughts about thoughts that we have, we would love to have that intellectual back and forth. That is the whole point of the website. So please follow us on social media. We are the Politics of Discretion on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. So follow, share, comment. You can always email me at politicsofdiscretion@gmail.com, and I will try to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for watching and for reading our content, and happy musings.